The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar, which is the third and final part in our series, Metrics Matter. My name is Philip Smith. I'm the Head of News and Content at Gorkana, and I'll be your moderator today. Throughout the series, we've been looking at the importance of measurement in PR and communications, and making the point that measurement is crucial if you are to prove success in your work. Today, ROI, or return on investment, is the focus, as we examine how ROI can be shown and how you can prove that successful PR has a positive business impact. However, if you missed either or both of the first two webinars in the series, please don't worry. Firstly, today's webinar should make sense in its own right. In addition, slides and recordings from the first two webinars and in time from this webinar will be available on YouTube at youtube.com/Gorkana Group. So go to youtube.com/Gorkana Group and you will find all three webinars. Details of this series are also available at gorkana.com. And of course, you always have the option to ask Paul, who is our presenter today, and for all three webinars in this series, any questions about areas that you'd like to be clarified or that you'd simply like to put him on the spot about. Paul, of course, is Paul Hender, Gorkana's Head of Insight. He's responsible for developing best practice insight services, training Gorkana's analysis teams, and designing analysis programs for Gorkana's enterprise customers. Today, in the webinar, Paul is going to take a look at ROI and how to prove success. To do this, he's going to be looking at what return on investment really means and what you need to know to work it out, how to work out the place of PR in your marketing mix, the attribution challenge, and there'll be examples of how businesses like London's V&A Museum proved PR success. After today, with the benefit of learnings from all three webinars, you'll be able to hear why and how you can set up an analysis and measurement program, which will give you insights into the success of your campaigns and your PR activity. Of course, measurement is very much on our minds at the moment at Gorkana, as we're in the run-up to this year's AMEC Summit, which is next week on the 15th and 16th in London, where the great and the good of the measurement world will meet to share knowledge, best practice, and recognise achievement. And for the summit on the 14th of June, Gorkana will wrap up the whole story of these three webinars in a special white paper, or an ebook if you prefer, which you can sign up for as well. So we'll make those details available for you. Look out for the link to sign up for that white paper in the email that follows this webinar, and obviously we'll make that available on Tuesday next week. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Paul for his presentation, but we will ensure there's time for your questions afterwards. So please do remember to send us your thoughts and questions. Use the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll pose as many of them as we've got time for to Paul. And yes, help me put Paul on the spot today. Anyway, that's more than enough from me. Paul, welcome to the webinar. Please start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you very much for that introduction, and hello and welcome. This is the third and final stage of our analysis road trip, our tour of analysis best practice and how you can benefit from it. As Philip says, we're running this in the run-up to the AMEC International Measurement Summit, which is in London next week. And if you missed the first two sessions, go to the YouTube channel, as you can see here, youtube.com/Gorkana Group. In our first session, we looked at why we're seeing this rise in the demand and the use of insight and analysis services in the communication space. In our second, we looked at how you should approach analysis, how you should choose the relevant metrics, how these metrics should be balanced around quantitative and qualitative metrics, and how they should be aligned with both the goals of the organization and the goals of the communications team. In our final session, I want to ask the question, so what? So what does this actually mean? So what have we learned? So what is the impact on our organization? So what is the return on our investment in our communications activity? We'll be looking at return on investment, taking a further look at the concepts of outputs and outcomes that we introduced in the previous two sessions. We'll look at how in a world where marketing disciplines are coalescing, understanding how these elements contribute to a greater whole is a challenge. the challenge of attribution. Finally, we'll look at bringing the various parts of this measurement jigsaw together to hopefully get a coherent picture. But first, the inspiration for the analysis road trip was a recent road trip that I'd done with my family in the US. As part of this, we'd spent some time in Death Valley, which seems ironic today, given that it's absolutely tipping it down with rain, one of the driest places in the world. It's the lowest point in the US at 300 feet below sea level, and it's where the hottest temperature in the world was recorded, 57 degrees Celsius. Luckily, it was not quite that hot when we were there, but you can still see how heat creates mirages, the illusion of water on the ground. For many years, I've wondered whether the search for return on investment in communications is like the exhausted and thirsty traveller in the desert, following the mirage in hope of getting to water, thinking they're getting close, only to see the mirage disappear and then reappear again much further away. Is this search for ROI a fruitless exercise? Does ROI actually exist? ROI is a term that gets bandied around. So it's important to understand what it actually means. ROI is actually a financial ratio comparing the gain from an investment minus the cost of the investment to the cost of investment itself. And this basic multiplicative nature of the definition causes problems itself. As the noted academic Tim Ambler, who is cited by the Chartered Institute of Marketing as one of the top 50 marketing experts in the world, points out in his article, ROI is dead, now bury it, the fastest way to maximize your ROI is actually to minimize your investment. As the cost of investment tends to zero, ROI tends to infinity. Tim provides examples of types of investment that actually produce better business gain despite technically having a lower ROI. Now, another challenge, particularly when it comes to communications, is to understand what investment and gain actually mean. I met a PR agency recently who had proudly announced on their website that one of their campaigns had generated an 8-to-1 return on investment. When I asked them how they'd calculated this, they said, well, the gain was the coverage that they generated, and that's what it would have cost if it was advertising, multiplied by 3, because that's the industry standard, isn't it? But that's not the gain. That's merely the cost of doing something else, multiplied by a made-up number. The gain would have been the profits the client made from selling more of its products as a result of people reading the coverage. So how can you calculate ROI without understanding the business benefit of what you are doing? AVEs have been explicitly called out in the Barcelona Principle as a metric that should not be used to measure ROI. AVEs are not the value of communication. Instead, it is recommended to focus on measuring the real gain. What are the outcomes in terms of the effect on the target audience? And ultimately, what is the effect on business performance? But here we run into a bit of a challenge. Every year, AMEC runs a survey of its members in order to get a picture of how best practice, as articulated in the Barcelona Principles, is being used in the real world. The most recent survey showed that measuring outcomes and business results came at the bottom of the list of how often the principles were used in practice. The use of AVEs was more widespread despite this common acceptance they should not be used. So how do we get to this situation where we all say we should measure outcomes and business results, but we don't do it? I think the problem comes when you think about the chain that links the investment to the gain. Now, if we were running a widget factory and we wanted to know the ROI of our widget making machine, it's actually fairly straightforward. We know how much our widget making machine costs, and we can measure the profits from the widgets that the machine makes. But with PR, what are we investing in? Well, we're investing in activity, events, interviews, press releases, pictures of kittens, and that's aimed at getting third-party influencers to write about us on different media channels. These are the media outputs, which are then read by our target audience, the outcomes, who may be affected as a result. And they can be affected in a variety of ways, from building awareness and knowledge through to prompting action. Have our target audience actually gone away and bought that shiny new iPhone? The challenge here is it's not always easy to bring all of these links together. It is actually relatively straightforward to measure activity, and then we can easily count the resulting media coverage. But understanding how this is affecting our audience is often a lot harder. It is somewhat intangible. It's perhaps not surprising that much of the industry attempts to bypass this by converting outputs into a pseudo ROI in the form of an AV multiplied by whatever you want. So the combined influence of all of these intangible effects on the key stakeholders to an organization, which if you think about it, I guess we can refer to this as reputation, is quite literally intangible, as I'll explain. Accountants refer to the gap between the real asset value of a company and its overall value, in other words, what the overall business is worth, as intangible assets. So when we sold our business Metrica as part of the series of transactions that formed Gorkana Group, it was sold for much more than the value of the assets on the balance sheet. The bigger value was based on the confidence of our ability to continue to serve our existing customers and to bring in new ones. So this valuation is ultimately a valuation of the reputation of the business. When we then appeared on the Gorkana balance sheet, the difference was referred to as goodwill, which is a type of intangible asset. Research by merchant bank Ocean Tomo has shown that the proportion of intangible assets in the Standard & Poor's 500 has dramatically increased in recent decades and now represents more than 80% of the value of a business. 80% of the value of our largest organizations is in something you can't see. So it ultimately boils down to the confidence that these businesses will continue to thrive and grow. And this boils down to the reputation of that organization to the important stakeholders. Former chairman of Marks & Spencer, Sir Stuart Rose, has said, for a business leader, building reputation and trust is the day job, which makes communication the day job too. Now we can see this link between reputation and value when things go wrong. In the first webinar, we talked about a number of famous media crises. Following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, the value of BP fell by more than 50%. After news broke that Barclays was being fined £290 million for fixing the LIBOR interbank lending rate, their value fell by almost a third. The value of Volkswagen fell by almost half when the Environmental Protection Agency accused the company of falsifying emissions tests. So with so much at stake, maybe we should go back to try and understand these links in the chain. So in the first two webinars, we introduced a model for measurement, which was this measurement framework that linked our strategic objectives with the tactical activity we're doing on a daily basis, and then how this drives media outputs and ultimately audience outcomes and organization results. Among the examples we looked at was NHS Blood and Transplant, whose purpose is to ensure the supply of blood and organs to hospitals. Their Missing Type campaign was aimed at raising awareness, particularly amongst ethnic minorities and young adults, and to encourage them to donate blood. And this was important because the number of new donors has declined by 40% over the previous 10 years. Now the results of the campaign were interesting. The campaign resulted in more than 57,000 new people donating blood, which exceeded their intended target of 40,000 in the month. But importantly, we were able to show the effect that the media coverage had on those donations by showing correlations between mainstream media, social media, and the number of new donor registrations. So we can clearly see here how spikes in coverage corresponded to uplift in donor registrations. We can also quantify this correlation using something called a correlation coefficient, which is a metric that goes between -1, which is perfect negative correlation, through to 0, which is no correlation at all, through to +1, which is a perfect positive correlation. And in this case, when we did the calculations, the correlation coefficient between mainstream media coverage and donors was plus 0.091, which is actually very strong and statistically significant at a 95% confidence level. Well, that sounds impressive, but there's a word of caution here. Here is another example. In this example, we can also see a statistically significant correlation. In this case, there is a statistically significant correlation between the number of people who drowned by falling into a swimming pool and the number of films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in. This is one of a number of examples available on a website, not surprisingly called spuriouscorrelations.com, run by a former law school student called Tyler Vigan. Now, the point that Tyler Vigan is making is that correlation does not necessarily mean causation, and that it's important to temper raw statistics with a bit of common sense. Incidentally, consumption of cheese has a statistically significant correlation with the number of deaths from people being tangled in bed sheets, which, given cheese's reputation for giving you bad dreams, may not be as spurious as it may first appear. Now, while we're giving words of warning, here is another. One of our clients is the Museum of London, and we were delighted when we won an AMEC award for our work with them back in 2013. Our entry highlighted the link between media coverage, website visitors, and then visitors to the museum. Not only did we have a statistically significant correlation, but the visitors lagged the media coverage, which suggested a causal link from one to the other. Now, I naturally was very proud of this award win and used the example as a case study when giving talks on best practice analysis. One day, I was presenting to a PR agency, and one guy at the back stuck his hand up as I was going through this example. "Excuse me," he said. "Yes," I replied. "Is that Spike by any chance the Dickens in London exhibition?" "Yes," I said, somewhat apprehensively. "How did you know that?" "Well, I went to that exhibition, and the reason that I went was because I saw an advert on the tube train, not because I read any coverage." Ah. So my bubble was well and truly burst. And it does beg the question, how do you understand the effects of your activity when there are lots of other activity, lots of other things going on, and potentially other causal factors at play? Well, we learned our lesson the year after this. We did the measurement for another museum, the Victorian Elder, when they ran a landmark exhibition on the life and work of David Bowie, and this seems somewhat poignant, talking about this now in the year that he died. This was one of the biggest events that the V&A has run and generated a record interest in visitor numbers. Again, we tracked media coverage and ticket sales. But this time, we were able to isolate the effects of PR in a couple of ways. First, the marketing was staggered so that only PR was used before and during the period where advanced ticket sales were available. Advertising actually came in a later phase. Second, the V&A ran a survey during the event itself asking whether visitors had heard about the exhibition. The majority referred to media coverage that they had read or watched. Digitization gives us further opportunities to understand these causal links. UNICEF, for example, want to get significant numbers of people to engage with them via their website, unicef.org, in order to donate money or support causes. We track mainstream and social media coverage and show how this drives website traffic. By using website analytics, we can see which online articles people have read immediately before visiting the site. Not only does this show that media coverage has the desired effect, but it also provides insight on what types of coverage are more effective at driving visitors, which the UNICEF comms team can then use to optimize future activity. As well as isolating the effects of PR coverage, there are also ways of understanding how PR contributes to more integrated marketing efforts. For GlaxoSmithKline, we produced an analysis of the PR of their Aquafresh Kids toothpaste brand. By listening to conversations on social media sites such as Mumsnet, GSK developed a number of great creative ideas to solve this common problem of getting young kids to brush their teeth. And I know you've had this experience, but as a dad, having had two kids go through this challenge, I can certainly sympathise. They did a number of great creative ideas. They developed tooth fairy calling cards, introducing the concept of tooth fairy inflation, the fact that kids get way more money these days than we ever used to. And they also developed an app that played music for the recommended 2 minutes it takes to brush your teeth properly. And this is all very well and good, and it generated a decent amount of media coverage. But, of course, the key question is, did it sell any toothpaste? Now, this is a potentially difficult question to answer, as there were a number of parallel marketing activities, from TV advertising to pay-per-click, online advertising to PR. We worked with GSK's analytics team to develop what's called an econometric marketing mix model to show how these different activities contribute to overall sales. Now, GSK were used to developing marketing mix models with various advertising inputs, but they'd not included PR before. The resulting model showed that PR contributed 3% to incremental sales. Now, that might not sound very much, but it was significant given the relative spend compared to advertising. Indeed, for every pound spent on PR, there were £4 of incremental sales. In other words, an ROI of 4 to 1. The highest return on investment of any marketing discipline. Now, this was a revelation to an organisation who, up until that point, had been advertising dominated. They realised that PR was becoming an increasingly important part of the marketing mix. and needed to take a key role in future activity. So to explain how this type of modelling works, let me use a more intuitive example. We worked with science and innovation charity Nesta to measure the effect of their Longitude Prize campaign. This was a competition to reward scientists and engineers with a prize of £10 million if they could solve one of the world's big challenges. The public would get to vote on which of 6 key challenges would be rewarded with a prize. So these challenges were antibiotics, paralysis, food, carbon-free flight, dementia, and clean water. The public could vote via a dedicated website, and the campaign was launched with a significant media campaign which included a BBC Horizon documentary and featured well-known figures in popular science such as Alice Roberts, Brian Cox, and Dara Ó Briain. The results would be announced on the primetime BBC programme The One Show. There was significant coverage following the launch on both mainstream and social media. The coverage reached 84% of adults in the UK and an even higher proportion of Nesta's target audiences. The quality of coverage was also high, with very strong message pickup. 97% of articles featured a key message. A high proportion of coverage featured a call to action, so 73% of articles called on the public to vote via the Longitude Prize website. So we can see the campaign generated both a high quantity and a high quality of coverage. But the key question is, did it engage people and get them to go and vote? To answer this, first we looked at the relationship between the mainstream media coverage and the subsequent engagement on social media. There was indeed a very strong correlation, and the nature of the coverage, so for example there were lots of retweets of online articles, suggested a causal link between the two. So far so good. We've got lots of coverage, it says the right things, it encourages people to vote, it's reached the right people, and it's driven social media engagement. But have people actually voted? The challenge was when we plotted mainstream coverage against website traffic, which was a decent proxy for votes, as that's where you need to go to in order to vote, there was not a strong correlation. Now looking at this further, the data is skewed by a huge peak in traffic at the end of June. Investigating, this was caused by an email campaign from Nesta's partner Amazon, who was supporting the campaign. So again, this is another lesson to be careful about measuring PR in isolation when there's multiple activity going on. So in order to understand what was going on, we built a marketing mix model to show how these different elements combined. To produce this model, we used a statistical technique called regression, which calculates the most likely weighting of each channel to explain the variation in the resulting outcome. So with Aquafresh Kids, it was sales. For Longitude Prize, it was votes. The results showed that although the Amazon activity generated the biggest peak in traffic, the longer burn time of mainstream and social media activity combined contributed to almost half of the overall web traffic and resulted in Nesta achieving their target of registering more than 100,000 votes overall. When you're planning a long journey, it helps to break it down into smaller stages. And what some of the examples we've seen over the course of this webinar series have shown that is that it helps to apply the same logic to communications measurement. So if we make a large jump from saying, we did this PR campaign straight to, and we achieved the 100,000 votes we wanted to, lacks credibility. As a cynic would rightly ask, well, how do you know this was down to what you did? So it helps to break this down into more manageable stages. 1, we launched the campaign. 2, the campaign resulted in 687 articles, including many pieces in key national newspapers and broadcast channels. 3, our key messages were delivered in 97% of coverage. 4, 73% of articles called on the public to vote via the Longitude Prize website. 5, coverage reached more than 84% of our target audiences. 6, coverage resulted in significant social media engagement. And finally 7, marketing mix modelling showed how the social and mainstream coverage contributed to half of the 100,000 votes, with the Amazon email campaign largely contributing to the rest. So you see, by breaking the measurement into stages and then following logically from one through to the next, we can plot our journey in a more tangible way to our ultimate goal. We can do it credibly, and we can do it without having to take a wrong turn down the road of an AVE or other pseudo ROI score. Now sadly, we've come to the end of our journey. It looks like we've come through relatively unscathed. Thank you for taking time to come on the road trip with me. I hope you found it a positive experience and maybe have even learned something along the way. I'll now hand back to Philip while I pull up the handbrake and turn off the ignition. Philip, over to you.
Great, and safe parking, Paul, but thank you so much for taking us on that journey, and I hope you've all enjoyed that. And now, we're looking at some questions here, so please do take the chance to send in more questions. We've got a good 10 minutes or so, and I'll put these to Paul. I will also remind you all that we will be making all these webinars available at youtube.com/Gorkana Group. Now, let's start with a question which goes right to the heart of correlation, which is something that you've warned us about, Paul. Do you find there is a correlation between the strength of the communication team's measurement and the buy-in from those higher up the food chain, which I assume means in terms of in the organization or in terms of the clients and so on? And this person says, I'm currently trying to increase this buy-in in my own business because currently our own measurement processes are not what it should be. Any tips?
So I think the short answer to that question is yes, I do think there's a correlation between how you measure and then getting buy-in from those higher up in the food chain. I think what I've seen is that senior management tend to be more data orientated, and a lot of the decision making they'll do, and indeed a lot of the discussions they'll have, is based on numerate data. So I think one of the challenges that communications people often have is speaking the language of the boardroom. So I think it really helps to paint the picture of what the communications team are doing using numbers, and then I think the important thing is then aligning it back to what the organisation is trying to achieve overall. Because if it's all about relevancy, so if you can make the measurement relevant to a senior audience, then you're much more likely to get the buy-in. I think the other thing that if you then convey, you can educate senior management on what PR can do, particularly given its relationship with other forms of activity, it strengthens the case for arguing for more budget and obviously preserving existing budgets.
And you did touch on an earlier webinar, but I think it's a point that's probably worth making again, is the importance of not devoting all your budget in that case towards the activity itself. There is a point where you must say some of this has to be put towards measurement, and you will see some gain from that.
Yes, and I think there's two gains. The first gain is what we've just alluded to, which is if nothing else, it's a communication tool that allows you to educate people in the business or the organisation of what it is you're doing. Given that, again, in my experience, there seems to be a lot of ignorance in terms of how communications works and how public relations works. So I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing that it really helps with is actually improving what you do over time. So even if you don't use it to say, well, this is the great stuff we're doing, it definitely helps in terms of maximising the effectiveness of what you're doing.
And it does seem to me, Paul, I mean, certainly from my experience in writing about media, marketing and PR, is that that may be at the root of where we've had this challenge of ROI, and an understanding of ROI is that people sort of have an assumption that's what it means and try and use that to communicate internally, because people do talk about ROI a lot, but you've tried to explain really what's at the root of that and where it makes sense and where it doesn't.
Yes, and I think there's another point here around, there's almost a desperation to get to a financial number, which is why AVs are very popular, and there's a pound sign in front of it. And I think that senior management, although clearly they want to know what the business benefit is, they're also used to making decisions based on imperfect data and intangibles. As we've seen, 80%, north of 80% of largest businesses are valued on things that people can't see. They're intangible assets. So it's, I think an important point to make is how the more we have these crises where we see that organizations lose value from not handling their reputation properly, it reinforces in the C-suite and the chief executives, who often have the people that have to be put in front of the journalists in the first place, that managing reputation is a really important thing. And it doesn't always tie back to a definitive number on a balance sheet.
Great, and thank you so much for sending in that question. Hopefully we've interpreted that, particularly in terms of what you meant about higher up the food chain and changing a business. But it's also led us very nicely, and even as you were answering that, this question came in. So, Paul, this is about intangible and the effects of reputation. And this question is, how can you link PR activity to some quite intangible measurements, such as gradual behaviour change of a specific audience?
I think there's two parts to that question. The bit that's very difficult to answer is the gradual change. So where a lot of the techniques we've looked at so far, a lot of the correlation work, a lot of the marketing mix modeling works really well, is when you see very strong variation over time. And you see a quite short-term variation. So we launch a campaign and we can see a spike in sales. That's relatively easy to show, or to have a degree of confidence that one thing's driving the other. In fact, you can, probability will also show that there's a good degree of confidence. It's a lot harder to show a gradual increase in time, which is, I think, an answer to that is just go back to this point about breaking the journey down into smaller chunks and just start building evidence in terms of what it is with, what coverage are we talking about, what coverage are we generating, what issues is it discussing, is it positive, is it negative, how's that building up over time, maybe linking it in with things like reputation tracking studies, which I'm seeing more and more. So a lot of organizations are tracking changes in stakeholder perceptions about an organization on a number of dimensions, but they're not just doing it as one-off activity, they're doing it month on month on month, and then you can see a gradual change over time. So I think it's that thing of just building those points of evidence.
Yeah. We have a question here about what's happening with something that I suppose didn't happen, a bit like the Sherlock Holmes story, the dog that didn't bark. And this is an excellent question, so I'll read this out to you, Paul. How do you measure the value of PR activity in managing down reputational risks, crisis communications? If we've killed a bad story, how do you provide a report to a board on something that didn't exist or was not as bad as it could have been?
This is a brilliant question. It is the curious incident of the dog in the night time. What was the curious incident? The dog didn't do anything. That was the curious incident. How do you measure stuff that isn't there? So this has been a challenge to me because a number of clients over the years have said this to me, and given that what I've done for more than 20 years is to count cuttings and measure them, they're potentially a hard one to answer, but there is a way. So one of the things you can do, and we've done this for a few clients, is that if you can measure your activity on certain issues and with certain journalists, and then map that against the coverage that you're generating, not only can you show, well, we've been proactive on this thing that we want to push out and look at the coverage you've generated as a result, but you can do the reverse, which is, well, we've had, let's say, 5 interactions with a particular journalist on an issue that we really don't want to get out into the media, and as a result, we haven't actually had any coverage talking about that particular issue. Now, because you can show that you have had the interaction and there has been no coverage, you can put those two things together. Now, when it comes to the fact that you still get coverage, then it's a case of measuring, well, have you mitigated against it? So, for example, if you measure the sentiment or tonality, have you converted something that's negative into something that's actually more neutral, say? Or have you got spokespeople in the media, and are they, even if the issue itself is a negative one, are they mitigating it with positive messages? So there's a number of things that you can do to actually show not only the activity you've done, but also then how that's affected the results.
So an absence of coverage is still measurable?
Yes, and it took me a while to realise that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that question. We've got time for one or two more, so do take the chance to ask us over the next 5 minutes or so. You can always send in those questions, and thank you for the ones that we've had today. One thing I wanted to ask you, Paul, which was, I think looking at your marketing mix model that you showed in the sort of the Aquafresh example near the end. What I was wondering is I saw that you were trying to work out the different periods of activity and different areas of activity. There were some very clear dividing lines, which I suspect are not that clear in real life. So I'm interested in the division between, say, social media and mainstream media. And is that an easy division to make? Is that the division you would recommend people made most of the time when they're looking at setting up a model and trying to measure their activity? So for instance, I was thinking about things like, I don't know, something that a news website had been writing about, but then tweeted. So that's both possibly mainstream and both social. How does that work, and would you always recommend that sort of division?
I think it's a very good question, because I think one of the challenges with measurement and one of the challenges with trying to create a model for how a complicated world works is, and the analogy is a bit like a map. You know, a map, if you think about a tube map, for example, the tube map bears no resemblance to what the layout of the underground system actually is, but it's quite useful because it shows you how all the stations are connected together and which lines you want to go on. So I think what you want to do is to rather than overcomplicate it, you simplify it. So I think it's a case of actually reducing the complexity. Now, in the example you mentioned, you've got a situation where you might have mainstream media and social media, and there might be some blurring of the lines between the two. So you might have journalists tweeting. Now, does that count as mainstream or social? Now, I think the reason we generally split the two out are for practical reasons of volume. So mainstream media tends to be much lower volume than social media. So if you lumped it all together in one bucket, you can't see the wood for the trees, you can't see what's going on. So it makes sense to split the two out and then look at the patterns of how the two interact with each other. But there might be examples where within social media, you might want to divide between influencers, so people who are actually trying to target, and they're trying to, they're generating content, if you like, that then influences other people, and then the reaction to what your, the population or the audience you're trying to convey, then how they respond. So there's a number of ways you can slice and dice the data, but I think it's always worth thinking, let's keep it simple rather than overcomplicate it.
So there are some very sort of clear ways that the data can be divided, and you would say have a look at those first, unless you have a compelling reason for not doing it that way.
Yes, yes.
As a final question, you talked about the learnings that you had with the Victorian Elder Museum and their David Bowie exhibition, and in that you said that one of the things that you were able to do was almost stagger activity. So there was a burst of PR before the advertising came in, and therefore you were able to see where spikes of activity led to outputs and then to outcomes. Is that always possible? And is there anything that you learned from doing that where you said, actually, this is a good way of doing that staggering? Because I know that in a lot of campaigns, people do like to launch a lot of activity at once, and may do it in phases or bursts. Were there any particular learnings that came from that where you would say, actually, this is a good way of doing that?
Well, I think that particular example, because they knew it was going to be a big event, one of the biggest they'd run. There was also a challenge, which is that what they wanted to do was to attract people they wanted to attract music lovers, and this audience didn't generally go to museums. So trying to attract an audience that didn't normally go to a museum. So a big element to this was not just to say, well, look, this event's coming up next weekend, off you go. It's to create a big, long build-up to it, which is why there were advanced ticket sales, which is why there was this big amount of publicity beforehand, and then advertising followed afterwards. So I don't think the tactics of doing that, I think, were related to trying to get this new audience at a quite large scale to come to this very large exhibition. The great outcome from it was that because these activities were separated out, you can then measure the separate effects, which is very useful in terms of understanding how that could work going forward. And indeed, with the V&A example, that exhibition actually then went on a tour around the world, and so they used the learnings from the one exhibition in London to then apply to how they then do the publicity in the subsequent tour.
Great. You've very neatly taken us from a road trip onto a world tour, and thank you so much, Paul, for all your time over not just today's webinar, but overall the 3 webinars in the series. And thank you everyone for joining us on Paul's analysis road trip, and particularly for coming along with us along the way and also asking us so many great questions. They've been a lot of fun to, well, for me to ask Paul them and for Paul to answer. I'm afraid, again, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to everyone for listening in. And thank you for those of you who've taken the chance to listen to everything in the Measurement Masters series. I hope that now you're convinced more than ever of the importance of measurement in PR communications. After all, measurement is crucial if you're to prove success in your work. We hope to see some of you at the Amex Summit next week, but either way, you can get these webinars on YouTube, and again, the URL is youtube.com/Gorkana Group, and on Tuesday, we'll be launching a special white paper which wraps up all the findings and the case studies and so on from the 3 webinars in a nice PDF that you can download from Gorkana, and we'll make available to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you soon. The webinar is now over.